a lone American warplane, declared lost over the Atlantic, materializes in the clouds over Nazi Germany. On the ground, a young German pilot watches in disbelief, convinced he's seeing a ghost. This is not a scene from a movie. This is a true story of survival, fate, and a debt of honor that span an ocean and a war. What happened when these two enemies were finally face to face decades later? Get ready for a story that will redefine your understanding of courage and reconciliation. Before we witness this incredible journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Now, let's begin. The Phantom of the Sky. The sky above Hamburg was a bruised and bleeding canvas. It was July 25, 1943, and the air itself tasted of cinders and doom. Operation Gamara was in its terrifying crescendo, a symphony of destruction orchestrated by hundreds of Allied bombers. Below, the city was a pit of fire and anguish. Above, the air crackled with violence. The deep-throated roar of B-17 flying fortresses, the sharp, angry bark of anti-aircraft flak bursting in black puffs, and the high-pitched whine of defending fighter planes. In this chaotic maelstrom, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter fought to breathe. At 22, he was already an old man in the eyes of the Luftwaffe, his youth spent in the cold, thin air of high-altitude combat. His Messerschmitt Bf-109 was his sanctuary, a cockpit of gauges and guns that felt more like home than his quarters on the ground. But today, the sanctuary felt fragile. The scale of the assault was overwhelming. A historical tide he was powerless to hold back. He banked his aircraft, his eyes constantly scanning the smoke-clogged heavens, searching for a target, for a purpose in the madness. His fuel was low, his ammunition even lower. A deep weariness, more mental than physical, threatened to cloud his focus. He was about to signal his wingman to break off and return to base when a flicker of movement caught his expert eye. Not the lumbering bulk of a bomber, nor the familiar shape of a German fighter. This was something else. A lone aircraft, sleek and strange, cut through the murk. Its twin-boom design and central cockpit nacelle marked it unmistakably. An American Lockheed P-38 Lightning. They were rare sights, these fork-tailed devils, and they were notoriously formidable opponents. But this one was not hunting. It was fleeing. Klaus watched, his professional curiosity piqued, as the P-38 descended through the tumult. Its movements were jerky, uncoordinated. A thin, white plume of smoke trailed from one of its engines. It was wounded. A lone wolf, separated from its pack and bleeding. A cold, automatic calculus took over in Klaus's mind. This was an opportunity. An easy kill. A confirmed victory to report amidst the day's failures. He pushed the throttle forward, the Mercedes-Benz engine of his Messerschmitt answering with a powerful snarl. He closed the distance with practiced ease, his hand steady on the control stick, his finger resting lightly on the cannon trigger. The P-38 grew larger in his gun sight. He could see the details now, the star and bar insignia, the subtle weathering of the olive drab paint, the code letters on the tail. He could almost see the pilot inside. He was seconds from firing. The order to engage screamed in his head, the training of years demanding he complete the mission. But another instinct, older and deeper, stirred. The American plane was not evading. It wasn't trying to fight. It was simply trying to survive, stumbling to the sky like a mortally wounded animal. In that suspended moment, the abstract concept of an enemy dissolved. All Klaus saw was a fellow aviator, a young man just like him, trapped in a metal coffin, desperately hoping to see another sunrise. A sharp, static-filled voice crackled in his headset. It was his wingman. "Richter, engage. What are you waiting for?" "Schießen, shoot him down." The command was clear. To disobey was unthinkable. Yet, Klaus's finger remained frozen. He nudged his stick and pulled up alongside the stricken Lightning, flying formation with it. He turned his head and looked directly into the adjacent cockpit. There he was, the enemy, a young man with a pale, sweat-sheen face visible behind his oxygen mask and goggles, his eyes wide with a terror Klaus knew intimately. The American pilot flinched, expecting the lethal burst of fire. When it didn't come, His expression shifted from terror to pure, uncomprehending shock. Their eyes locked. For 5 endless seconds, the war ceased to exist. There was no Führer, no fatherland, no president. There were only two boys suspended between heaven and hell, sharing a silent, desperate conversation. Without breaking eye contact, Klaus gave a single, slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of triumph, but one of grim acknowledgement. Then he abruptly broke away, banking his Messerschmitt hard to the left and diving back into protective smoke below, leaving the phantom lightning to its uncertain fate. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of confusion and guilt. Back on the ground, he would file a terse report. Engaged, damage P-38 near cloud cover. Target lost before definitive engagement. A lie by omission, a secret etched into his soul. In the decades that followed, the memory of that day would visit Klaus Richter in quiet hours of the night. The image of that terrified young American pilot haunted him. Had his moment of mercy been an act of cowardice? Had he allowed a dangerous enemy to live, who would return to kill his countrymen? Or had he, for one fleeting moment, held on to a shred of his own humanity in a war that sought to strip it all away? The ghost of Hamburg, he was sure, was gone, swallowed by the North Sea or the pages of history. He never expected to get an answer. He never expected the ghost to find him. The unfinished mission. For Captain James Jimmy Sullivan, the world had narrowed to the piercing shriek of a dying engine and the acrid smell of burning glycol that filled the cockpit of his P-38, the dauntless Dottie. One moment, he was part of the vast, terrifying armada unleashing hell on Hamburg. The next, a sickening jolt and a shower of sparks had turned his powerful fighter into a crippled bird. A lone, lucky shell from flak batteries below had found its mark, tearing a gaping hole in his right side radiator. The orderly world of formation flying, radio chatter, and mission parameters evaporated. Now, there was only a single primal objective: survive. Alarms blared in his ears, but he barely heard them over the labored, metallic grinding of his failing Allison engine. Smoke, thick and white, streamed past his canopy, obscuring his vision. With a calm that felt alien to his 20-year-old self, Jimmy feathered the prop, wrestling control stick to keep the asymmetrical thrust from sending him into a fatal spin. His mind raced, calculating vectors, distances, and dwindling odds. His mission was no longer Hamburg. It was a cold, gray expanse of the North Sea, over 100 miles away. If he could just coax the Dottie that far, he might have a chance of ditching near the Allied shipping lanes. Then he saw it, a shadow moving fast through the smoke. His blood ran cold. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, its shark-like nose and cross-marked fuselage coming into sharp, horrifying focus. This was it. This was the end. With a crippled plane, he was utterly defenseless. A turkey shoot. He instinctively braced himself, his body tensing for the impact of 20mm cannon shells, for the shattering of plexiglass, for the searing pain of shrapnel. He closed his eyes for a second, a silent prayer for his mom back in Oregon on his lips. But the impact never came. Cracking his eyes open, he saw the impossible. The German fighter had pulled alongside him, so close he could see the rivets on its skin. He could see the pilot, a blurred figure behind the canopy. Jimmy's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the slower, dying rhythm of his engine. This was a cruelty he hadn't anticipated. The German was toying with him, drawing out the kill, savoring the moment. He waited for the nose of the Messerschmitt to light up with fire. Instead, nothing happened. The two planes flew in formation, locked in a surreal, silent ballet above the burning city. Jimmy turned his head, and through the smoke and glare, he made eye contact with the German pilot. He saw not a monster, not a Nazi, but a face as young as his own, etched with the same strain and exhaustion. The man's eyes held not triumph, but a deep, conflicted intensity. Time stretched and warped. It felt like an eternity. Then, with a slight dip of his wing, the German pilot nodded. A single, curt gesture. Before Jimmy's stunned mind could process it, the Bf-109 peeled away with a roll and was swallowed by the thick, black smoke below, leaving Jimmy alone with the ghostly echo of the encounter. The shock was so total it momentarily overrode his fear. Why? The question screamed in his mind, louder than the engine's death rattle. There was no time to answer it. The dauntless Dottie gave a final, shuddering gasp. The last of the power bled away, and the cockpit fell silent except for the whistle of the wind. Jimmy was going down. He wrestled with the controls, guiding the lifeless hulk of metal in a long, shallow glide toward the distant water. The chill of the North Sea awaited him. His war was not over, but it was about to change. The merciful enemy in the sky was replaced by the cold embrace of the sea and later, the bleak, unforgiving reality of a prisoner of war camp. The memory of that German pilot became his touchstone, a single, shining artifact of humanity in the long, dehumanizing years of captivity. In the stale, crowded barracks, staring at the barbed wire, he would replay those seconds over and over. The face, the nod. It was a lifeline, a proof that the world was not entirely mad. Who was he? Why did he do it? The question became a quiet obsession, a puzzle he could not solve but could not abandon. 40 years later, the war was a collection of stories told at reunions, fading photographs, and the occasional nightmare that would jolt him awake in his comfortable bed in Portland, Oregon. The memory of the German pilot had softened into an anecdote, one his wife would patiently listen to and his old squadron mates would dismiss with a friendly clap on the shoulder. "You got a concussion from the ditching, Jimmy boy," they'd say. Or maybe it was an angel. Lord knows you needed one. But his daughter, Sarah, a journalist with her father's tenacity and her mother's empathy, saw the truth in his eyes when he told the story. She saw the young man still trapped in there, still seeking answers. During a visit, as they looked through his old flight log, she said the words that would change everything. "Let's find him, Dad." It was a preposterous idea. The world was vast. The war had scattered and buried millions of stories. But Sarah was relentless. She placed a small, carefully worded advertisement in a few international aviation magazines and historical society newsletters. It was a shot in the dark, a message in a bottle tossed into a vast ocean. Asterisk seeking information on German pilot flying Bf-109, an engagement near Hamburg, July 25, 1943. Involved P-38 Lightning Dauntless Dottie. Please contact J. Sullivan, asterisk. Weeks turned into months. Life resumed its peaceful, predictable rhythm. Jimmy gardened, played with his grandchildren, and gradually let the faint hope die. He was a practical man. He had survived. He had built a wonderful life. Some mysteries, he concluded, were meant to stay mysteries. The ghost of Hamburg will remain just that, a ghost. Then, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. It was Sarah, and her voice was trembling, charged with emotion he hadn't heard in her since she was a little girl. "Dad," she said, the word catching in her throat, "you need to sit down. You're not going to believe this. We got a letter from Munich." The letter from Munich. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. The envelope, a crisp, off-white linen paper, felt foreign and weighty in Jimmy Sullivan's hands. The return address was etched in precise, elegant script. Munich, West Germany. His own name and address were written in the same careful hand. Each letter formed with a deliberate clarity that spoke of age and patience. The air in his quiet Portland home grew still. For a long moment, he just stood in his hallway, holding it, his heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. This was it. The message in a bottle had been found. He carried it to his worn leather armchair by the fireplace, the one that had been his refuge for decades. He used a bone letter opener, a gift from his late wife, slicing the envelope with a reverence usually reserved for holy texts. The paper inside was of the same high quality, and the script, now covering the page, was even more striking up close. It was the handwriting of a man who took his time, who measured his thoughts. "Dear Captain Sullivan," it began, "I read your advertisement in Fly Past magazine with great interest and no small amount of emotion. For many days after, I found myself quite preoccupied. My thoughts returned to a time I have long tried to reconcile with." Jimmy's breath caught. He had to stop, put the letter down, and look out the window at his rain-drenched garden, just to anchor himself in the present. This was real. He picked it up again, his hands now exhibiting a faint tremor. Asterisk. The details you provide are unmistakable. The date, July 25th, 1943. The location, the skies northwest of Hamburg. The aircraft, a P-38 Lightning, trailing smoke from its right engine. I remember the weather most vividly, the way the sun broke through the smoke in fractured, terrible beams. I remember the firestorm below. It was a day that has never left me. Asterisk. The words blurred for a second. Jimmy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a rough, impatient gesture. He was back there. He could smell the glycol, feel the stick shuddering in his hand. I was the pilot in the Messerschmitt 109. I closed on your aircraft and had you in my gun sight. It was my duty to fire. Yet, when I saw your situation, when I saw a fellow aviator not an enemy, but simply a young man trying desperately to survive, I could not. I pulled alongside. I saw your face. You looked at me, and I at you. I gave a nod, which I see you remember. I then broke away and returned to the chaos from which I came. A sob escaped him, a short, sharp sound in the silent room. It was confirmation. It was validation. For 40 years, a part of him had wondered if the stress, the trauma, had fabricated a memory. But it was real, every second of it. The nod, it was all real. I have often wondered about your fate. I assumed your aircraft succumbed to its damage over the sea. To learn that you survived is, for me, a profound relief. For many years, I have questioned my decision. Was it an act of mercy or one of treason against my duty? Your letter provides an answer I had long given up hope of ever receiving. The letter was signed, with my highest regards, Klaus Richter. Jimmy read it again, and then a third time. Each word was a brick, rebuilding a bridge across an ocean and a war. He immediately called Sarah, his voice thick with emotion, reading the entire letter to her over the phone. They cried together, separated by miles, but connected by the sheer magnitude of this moment. That night, Jimmy sat at his desk, a blank page before him. How did one respond to such a thing? How did you thank a man for your life? The words came slowly at first, then in a flood. He wrote of his ditching, his capture, the long years in Stalag Luft 3. He wrote of how that moment of mercy had become a beacon for him, a memory he clung to in the darkest times. You showed me that humanity could exist even in that hell, he wrote. Because of you, I came home. I fell in love. I raised a family. I lived a life. Any good I have done in this world is because you chose to let me live. Thank you. A correspondence began, letters crossing the Atlantic every few weeks. They started with the war, meticulously reconstructing that day from their two perspectives, a shared historical project. But soon, the letters evolved. They began to share pieces of their lives. Klaus wrote of his career as an architect, helping to rebuild the cities the war had destroyed. He spoke of his love for classical music, particularly Brahms. He enclosed a photograph of himself and his wife, Elke, standing before a neat garden in Munich. He looked serious, dignified, with a gentle warmth in his eyes. Jimmy sent photos of his family, Sarah, his grandchildren, a picture of himself proudly standing next to a restored P-38 at an air show. He wrote of Oregon's forests, of fishing for salmon, of the strange peace of retirement after a life of such intense action. They were no longer just two former soldiers exorcising a ghost. They were becoming friends. They discovered a shared fondness for dry wit and terrible puns. Jimmy would mail Klaus a bag of whole coffee beans from a local roastery, and Klaus would send back exquisite European chocolates for Jimmy's grandchildren. It was Sarah who gave voice to the idea that had been simmering in both their hearts. "You have to meet him, Dad," she said one evening, watching him seal another letter to Germany. "This can't just be on paper. You need to see him." The proposal, when Jimmy wrote it, was tentative, full of caveats. He understood if it was too much, too strange, too emotionally fraught. Klaus's response was swift and characteristically direct. "My dear Jimmy, I have faced many fears in my life. The prospect of finally meeting the man whose eyes I have seen in my dreams for half a century is a fear I would gladly embrace. It would be my honor. Elke and I would be delighted to host you and your daughter in our home." The planning was a whirlwind. Passports, flights, itineraries. But as the date of the flight to Munich drew near, a deep and familiar anxiety began to coil in Jimmy's stomach. The ghost was becoming a man with a life, a family, opinions. What if the connection they'd built through ink and paper evaporated in person? What if the weight of their shared history was too heavy? What unspoken resentments might lie beneath the surface of Klaus's graciousness? The night before the flight, Jimmy didn't sleep. He sat in his chair, holding the first letter from Munich, wondering if he was making the most wonderful mistake of his life. The following evening, he found himself standing on a quiet, cobblestone street in Munich. The air was cool and carried the scent of baking bread from a nearby shop. Before him was a cafe they had agreed upon, a neutral, public place for this first encounter. Through the window, he could see him, an elderly man, back straight, hair swept back in silver waves, sitting at a small table and nervously adjusting a coffee cup. Klaus Richter, the ghost of Hamburg. Jimmy's hand went to the door handle. It felt colder than the North Sea. He took a deep, shuddering breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The final flight. The gentle chime of the cafe door was a sound wholly inadequate for the moment it heralded. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant with the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee and buttery pastries. Soft conversations in German created a low, comforting hum. And there, at a small table by the window, sat the man, Klaus Richter. He was older than the vision Jimmy had carried for 4 decades, his hair a brilliant silver, his face a map of lines etched by time and memory. But the posture was the same, ramrod straight, a lifetime of discipline in the set of his shoulders. He was meticulously dressed in a tweed jacket, his hands resting on the table, one of them gently turning a coffee cup on its saucer in a slow, nervous circle. He was staring into the middle distance, his expression one profound, almost painful anticipation. Jimmy felt his own feet root to the spot just inside the door. The noise of the cafe faded into a distant murmur. His heart, which had been a frantic drumbeat on the street outside, suddenly settled into a slow, heavy, and terrifying thud. This was it. This was the face from the gun sight. This was the man who held the other half of his life's most defining moment in his memory. He forced himself to move, each step on the creaking wooden floor feeling monumental. He stopped a few feet from the table. Klaus hadn't seen him yet, lost in his thoughts. Jimmy took a quiet breath. "Herr Richter?" he said, his voice softer than he intended. Klaus's head snapped up, those blue eyes, the same ones that had held us from a cockpit, now focused on him. There was a flicker of shock, then intense scrutiny, as if Klaus were comparing the man before him to the young, terrified face he remembered. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the weight of 40 years. Then, something remarkable happened. Klaus Richter's stern expression softened. A slow, sad, and deeply gentle smile touched his lips. He did not stand to shake hands. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, straightened his back even further his chair, and gave a single, slow, solemn nod. It was an exact echo of the gesture he'd made in the sky over Hamburg, a nod of recognition, a nod of respect that transcended language and time. The simple, silent power of it shattered the last of Jimmy's defenses. The breath left his lungs in a rush, and tears, which he had sworn he would control, welled up and spilled over without permission. He saw the same glistening moisture in Klaus's eyes. "Jimmy!" Klaus said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, tinged with strong German accent. He said the name not as a question, but as a statement of fact, a final, satisfying piece of a puzzle sliding into place. Jimmy extended his hand. "Klaus." Klaus stood then, his movement slightly stiff, and took Jimmy's hand. The handshake was firm, strong, but it lasted only a second before Klaus did something entirely unexpected. He stepped forward and pulled Jimmy into a tight, fierce embrace. It was not a gesture between new acquaintances. It was the embrace of brothers who had been separated by a long and terrible war. They stood there in the middle of the quiet cafe, 2 old men holding each other, their shoulders shaking with the release of a burden they had both carried for a lifetime. The other patrons respectfully looked away, granting them this private, public moment of healing. They sat for hours. The coffee grew cold and was replaced. They talked not of politics or strategy, but of the human experience of that day. Klaus spoke of the voice in his headset screaming at him to fire, of the cold fear of court-martial that followed his decision. Jimmy spoke of the shock, the disbelief, and the long years in the camp where the memory of that nod was a talisman against despair. They discovered a shared dark humor about the absurdities of army life and a mutual love for their grandchildren. The war, the reason for their meeting, began to recede, becoming merely the prologue to the story they were writing now. The following day, Klaus and his wife Elke, a woman of immense warmth and grace, took Jimmy and Sarah to the Deutsches Museum Flugwerf-Schleißheim, an aviation museum on the outskirts of Munich. They stood together in a vast hangar, beneath the silent wings of history, a restored Bf-109 and a visiting American P-38, displayed not as enemies, but as artifacts of a shared past. The two old pilots stood side by side between the aircraft, a living bridge between them. Jimmy looked from one machine to the other, his mind superimposing the sounds of screaming engines and the smell of cordite over the museum silence. "You know," Jimmy said quietly, his gaze fixed on the P-38, "I spent years calling you the ghost of Hamburg, but I was wrong. You weren't a ghost. You were my guardian angel." Klaus shook his head, a humble, dismissive gesture. "Neen, Jimmy, I was not an angel. I was just a boy who remembered his humanity. If only for a moment. I believe truly that you would have done the same." Before they left for the airport, the two men exchanged gifts. Jimmy presented Klaus with his old, carefully preserved leather flying jacket, the very one he'd worn that day. It was soft with age, a tangible piece of his history. "So you'll always know I made it home," Jimmy said, his voice thick. In return, Klaus gave Jimmy his Fliegerschutzenschnur, his Luftwaffe pilot's badge. It was cool and heavy in Jimmy's hand. It was not a symbol of an enemy, but a symbol of a fellow aviator's skill, his journey, and his honor. "So you will always know," Klaus replied, "that I saw you not as a target, but as a brother." On the flight home, Jimmy stared out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below. He wasn't just bringing home a war story to tell his friends. He was bringing home proof that a single, split-second choice for kindness could ripple across decades. Proof that the deepest wounds could heal, and that the most unlikely threads could be woven into the strongest bonds. He had gone to Munich to confront a ghost from his past, and had instead found a friend for the rest of his future. The final flight home was the most peaceful he had ever known. If this incredible true story of forgiveness and a bond forged in the crucible of war moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder of our shared humanity. What act of compassion has changed the course of your life? Tell us in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more powerful stories of connection that transcend the deepest divides.